I'm from Google. I've been at Google about 5 years or so. Previous to that, I worked at Ordnance Survey down in Southampton. I worked with Graham, so we kind of know each other. And throughout my career, I've been a geographer. And I'm of the generation, you can tell from my grey hairs, I was old enough, young enough at the time at school to be of the generation where we were teaching our teachers how to use the computers that had been delivered, and that's how I kind of got into computers and geography, what we now call geospatial technology, just a posh term for computers and geography. What I want to spend today about is, the next, I suppose, hour or so, is talking about a big picture of where this technology is heading. It's probably something that you're quite familiar with. You probably use Google Maps, you've got a TomTom in your car. A lot of the kind of underlying technology that you see demonstrated in that technology actually is across the whole of the web, perhaps less obvious. And that's really what we're going to talk about. I need to turn the feedback down a little bit, I think. Okay, so today we're going to talk about this idea of the annotated world, a concept really that says looking above and beyond traditional maps as a way of representing the world around us and the content that's involved in that and how we interact with it. And one of the most interesting parts of my job is recognizing how powerful geographic information, geospatial technology is at telling stories. It's powerful because it's often very visual. It's something that we can relate to by looking at pictures. And probably one of the most powerful images that we know is this one. It's something that we're all very familiar with, the idea of this blue marble, our fragile planet sitting out in the darkness of space, the idea of the kind of island Earth, this is our past, this is our future. It's a very powerful, a very emotive image, and it's used many, many times. We probably see this image many, many times a week on TV programs, in advertising, and everywhere. And it all means something to us. Maybe it means something to us because of our personal history or our interest in the environment or whatever. What's interesting, though, is for something that's so powerful, so emotive, so well known to us, has only been seen by about 20 people with their own eyes. It was actually first seen in 1968 by the crew of Apollo 8 on their way to the moon. And they came round the dark side of the moon, and for the first time, they saw the planet, the Earthrise picture that's now so familiar to us. And it had a huge impact on them, as you can imagine. There they were, 250,000 miles away from home, looking back at their planet. And yet we now still have that same connection to that image. But we haven't seen it with our own eyes. We see it through tools like Google Earth. Google Earth allows us to explore the planet, to look at different scales of activities. We can look at the whole globe, we can look at climate change, we can look at the routes of airliners, or we can zoom down, as we all do, and look at our back garden and look over virtually the fence and see what's going on in our garden, our neighbour's garden, something we all enjoy doing. There are about 1 billion users of Google Earth. 1 billion people have downloaded Google Earth. There are around 1 billion users of Google Maps and Google Earth every week. That's about 1/3 of the population on the internet. To give you another idea of the context around that, it's about equivalent to Facebook and Twitter combined. That's how pervasive geospatial technology is now. We're accessing this information all the time, and we do so without a huge amount of thought about it, all the technology that goes on behind the scenes. And that's something that has actually changed quite radically in the last 10 years. The accessibility to this information is something that has only really come in the last 10 years, despite the fact that much of the technology has been around for much longer than that. But I've mentioned this idea of the annotated world. Where does that fit in? The annotated world is going beyond the image, going beyond viewing satellite imagery or aerial photography of a particular place, and actually starting to pull out information that perhaps otherwise would be invisible. There's a concept well known in geography called Borgas Map, and Borgas was a philosopher who came up with this idea of a one-to-one scale map. Imagine we could make a map that was the same scale as reality. What could we show on the map? And at the time it was perceived as this impossible thing, because clearly you can't make a map that's the same scale as reality. Well, actually now, in a digital sense, we can do that. We can make a map that is one-to-one scale. Actually, we can go beyond that. We can have a map that is of no scale. We can start to see beyond what you would normally see in a map. Now, we're quite proud of something like this. This is the Google map of where we are. We can say, oh, we're not actually quite where we are. That's down the bottom of the high street, I guess, here in Farnham. But that's kind of the map that we're familiar with. And you might well say, well, it's not bad. It's got all the street names on it. It's got the river. It's got parks. We could maybe add a few more buildings to it. We could add a bit more information. But this is kind of state-of-the-art in some ways. We have to go quite a lot further, though, to really make that map this kind of one-to-one scale representation of the real world. To give you some idea of what I'm talking about, I'm just going to pull up the street view image of that particular area. So those of you from Farnham will recognize this probably reasonably well. And you can see in street view, we're trying to begin to annotate the image that you see. We're beginning to add little tags that tell you a bit more information about the buildings you're looking at. But what we actually want to do is to start to augment that image with information that wouldn't be visible to us with our naked eye. So, and one of the first things that we started working on, if you think about how we've developed digital mapping, was to add on the restrictions in terms of the direction you can drive. So we know this is a road that you can only drive in a particular direction, but you can make a turn here. That's information that's not visible in the image, but it's something that we can put into a map, we can put it into a digital database. And that's very familiar to us if we've used a satellite navigation system. That's quite straightforward. We might want to pull out details about local businesses. So there's the flower stall. We can pull out its address, we can pull out its postcode, we can find its telephone number, and we can find that it's got a website. That in itself is useful information. It allows us to do things that are actionable. We can now find out about that particular business. We could go and visit it, we could telephone it, we could find out more information. It gives us links to other content. And we can harvest that information from the web. And we can do that. We can do that because, well, some of that information is actually geographic. The postcode we can use to link to a particular location. We could find other people that are visiting that and tie it to that location. But that's quite conventional. That's not really taking us much further. Maybe I'd be interested in finding out where are the public waste bins. Did you know there are 2 waste bins there on the corners? We're beginning to look at how can we do that automatically, because believe it or not, there is no national database of public waste bins. So you can maybe, we're kind of looking at interpreting the imagery. Can we identify what a waste bin looks like in an image and do some image recognition to try and pull those out? Again, that's useful information to have. Likewise, in terms of doing image recognition, we can look at the signs that are available and accessible in this image. We can find there's a sign here that has parking restrictions. And we can do some text recognition and pull out the information on that sign and actually find out what the parking restrictions are. Again, funnily enough, there is no national database of parking restrictions. So we start to build up our own information from analyzing the data that we can see on the image, or from other sources of information. So you can see what we're trying to do here in terms of annotating the world is finding out information about different places and various sources of information and conflating that together, and then we'll have the challenge of how do we present that information to users in a useful way. The final piece of annotation I want to talk about, and there are as many examples as you can think of, is a hotel that's down the road here, the Bush Hotel, and the fact that tonight, and this is true because I did this presentation putting it together this morning, I could get a room at that hotel for £109 this evening. Again, that was a case of going off to different places on the web, finding out information that they have been publishing on their own hotel's website and pulling that information together. Now, I mentioned, well, how do we make this information useful? How do we present it back to our user community? Well, we're starting to think about doing that with things like this. This is a place page that's associated with that particular hotel. And you can see what we're doing here is trying to collate content that exists elsewhere on the internet. So we pulled up some pictures that either the hotel themselves may have contributed or people have taken photos, they've geocoded them, they put them online, we can identify that about this particular hotel. We pulled up the map, we can find driving directions, we can link through to the booking, we can make a booking for any particular date, or we can find out reviews, content from other people on the web and how they've commented about how good a hotel it was, or is the restaurant worth visiting. It's trying to, again, collate all that information that exists on the web and present it in a way that's straightforward and easy for people to use. And we're still experimenting with this. In some ways, this is quite conventional. It's a web page, and if you search for the Bush Hotel in this case, that will be one of the first hits that you would see. But it's still quite a conventional way of getting access to it. But it has conflated, brought all of that information together. In terms of creating the annotated world, as I said, there's an element that we go off and we find what already exists. But we're increasingly looking at creating tools that allow people to annotate the world as they move around it. So as you're interacting with the world around you, you're visiting places, you're going to businesses, you're staying at hotels, we want a way for you to be able to capture that information, publish it in a way that's accessible to people on the web as well. And here are two example tools that we're developing. The first one is here on the mobile phone. This is tied into your Google Plus account, and it allows you to very quickly review a particular business or a restaurant or a hotel. You see it has a very simple scoring mechanism, whether you like the food, whether you like the decor, what's the service like, what's the rough cost, write a short review, and then you can post that, and it becomes part of that content that appears on that place page that I was talking about. The other example here is slightly more complicated, a bit more traditional geospatial technology, if you like. And this is a tool that we haven't launched yet in the UK, but it's coming any day, which is what we call Google Map Maker. And that allows you to actually add content that doesn't appear on the map. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm tracing out the border of the building here, of the castle. And in a few days, that will appear in Google Maps. It goes through a moderation process, so we make sure that people aren't digitizing Wembley Stadium in the middle of Surrey and making, huge errors. But it's a way of, if there's content missing on the map or the map's wrong, you can update it. You are the local expert in your particular part of the world. You should be able to demonstrate that expertise and add that information into the map. So this is a way of annotating the world just as you interact with it, by you doing it rather than us relying on content that already exists. There's a social element to this as well, and I wouldn't say this was completely all-encompassing, but it is nevertheless quite useful. And this is trying to catch that information that, if I was coming to Farnham for the first time, I would ask Graham, so what's a good restaurant? Because I know Graham, I know he lives here, but it might be that I have a bigger social network, and people in that social network may also have been to Farnham that I didn't know about, that they've been here. And that actually was the case. Here I was searching for a pub in Farnham, and this is the information that came back to me using this local places application. And it says, Nelson Arms is good. It's being recommended to me because my friend Andrew wrote one of those reviews using that little application I showed you before. So now, rather than just choosing perhaps the restaurant that's closest to me or the one that perhaps meets some other search combination, I'm now beginning to see what my friends thought of those particular businesses, and that becomes part of the process of being recommended or not. Okay, so that's the kind of state of play where we are today. This is kind of building out this annotated world, getting more and more content. For many ways, you can look at geospatial technology and say that it really is something where content is king. It's all about getting as much data, as rich, useful information as possible to really make the difference. But then, where do we go next? What's the future going to be? And this is, I think, where we might get a little bit of insight. So what's the next 10 years for geospatial technology going to look like? Making use of the now infamous meme of Back to the Future. You can now, any date was the Back to the Future date, it so seems. So in 10 years' time, what we might look at. Well, one of the things that seems to be on the minds of a lot of people at the moment is this idea of building a virtual world in 3D. You can tell that this is on the mind of the mass media when the Daily Mail misreport it. So here's the Daily Mail saying, yeah, me too, Amazon purchased startup to join Google and Apple in 3D mapping wars. Who would have ever thought that the Daily Mail would be reporting of 3D mapping wars? You wouldn't expect them to report it accurately, but even reporting it, I thought, was unusual. The 3D mapping wars they're talking about is this. This is a video of the creation of 3D data. We do this now from aerial photography. We fly over a city in a grid pattern, and from the photographs that we take, looking out at 45 degrees, we completely automatically create this synthetic model of reality. And looking at it, you'd be hard-picked to identify that this is a virtual image as opposed to someone taking a TV camera and flying out with a helicopter. Now, you might say, well, that looks a bit like Google Earth. Well, yes, this is Google Earth, but it's using, as I said, this new technology that uses photographs to create the 3D model. In the past, the 3D data in Google Earth came from lots of different sources of data, this idea of conflating different data sets together. So we'd get 3D building models from perhaps one source of data, and we get a terrain model from someone else, and the models would all come at different points over time, and it would never be complete. The thing with the new process is that because you, in effect, capture a city over the period of a day or two, you get a consistent view of everything in 3D, and that includes trees, every building, every piece of terrain, and potentially, one of my favorite areas to look at, if you get the opportunity, is an aviation museum in Arizona, where every aircraft is parked in true 3D, and you can see the detail and fly around it. This is amazing new technology. We'll see this increasingly as a way of interacting with the maps. So it's available there in Google Earth. The next version of the Maps app on iOS will have 3D content. Nokia actually have had 3D content for a while, but no one talks about Nokia. Shame. What can you do? And obviously, as you saw from the review there, Amazon likewise are getting into this technology. So it's gee whiz. It's exciting, and it looks fantastic. It's very visual. But for those of us who are deeply involved in geospatial technology, we will turn around and we will say to you, yes, but it's not actually 3D. And no, boo. It's not actually 3D, it's just a surface. What we're doing is we're creating a surface model, photogrammetrically, and we're putting a texture onto that model. So it's imagine, you've put a sheet over some boxes and some shoes, and you've created a kind of surface, and then you projected a box and a picture of a shoe onto that sheet. It's not really the content of the shoe, it's not really the content of a box, you've just made a surface. So we call it 2.5D, because it's just a surface. Real 3D, actually being able to go inside a building and navigate inside that building and all of the structures around that, that's really, really hard to do. We're still struggling with that. But in the next 10 years, that is something that we will solve. We will get true 3D data. You'll be able to explore not only outside, but inside buildings, inside structures, be able to navigate conceptually from your bed, through your house, out, using a public transport system, through tube stations, through airports, back to your hotel room. Every step of the way, there will be content that will allow you to do that. Now, that's a much, much bigger task than we're currently able to do. But we are making a start, and that I call the great indoors. Because actually what we've done in geospatial technology up until now has largely ignored indoors. You know, satellite navigation systems don't work as soon as you get inside a building. And a lot of the data content that we've used so far has been driven, and I'm quite happy to use the pun, by the use of automotive manufacturers who wanted car navigation systems. We haven't really dealt with the indoors yet. But we're making a start. This is the local department store for us at Google in London. This is Peter Jones, which is on Sloane Square. This is quite a posh version of John Lewis, basically. And what we've done working with John Lewis is we've gone in and we started making maps of the internal structure of all of their department stores. And they've given us all the CAD package files that describe the insides of their stores. And crucially, for this to work, they've also allowed us to go and survey the Wi-Fi signals that happen inside those stores. And one of the things that John Lewis has done in the last year is install Wi-Fi in all of their stores. And they're very brave. You can go into John Lewis and you can pick up something, scan it with the app on your phone and see how much it costs on Amazon. And they still think, well, we could do the cost comparison, you'll still buy in John Lewis. But one of the byproducts of the fact that they put the Wi-Fi in is that we can use that Wi-Fi for location determination, to actually work out whereabouts you are in the store. So if I go into John Lewis, and I pull out my smartphone, I can find exactly where I am in the store. You can see there's that little blue arrow there. That's my location. You can see the various departments of John Lewis, and it knows which floor I'm on because of the different Wi-Fi signals depending upon which floor I am. So I can navigate around the store knowing where I am at any particular point in time. You zoom in, you can see that in a little bit more detail. And it is accurate to about 2 or 3 meters. So it's enough to know which department you're in a store. We also have this in most of the major railway stations in London. We're working on the museums. You can go into the British Museum. Likewise, it will show you whereabouts you are. And that's the place I always get lost, in the British Museum. This will be really useful. So that's quite neat. And it also makes sure you don't get into that awful situation where you get trapped into a department store getting near the laundry department. So this will never happen to you. As soon as you can get near the laundry department, an alarm can go off, turn 180 degrees, go in a different direction. It won't happen to you. So the great indoors is something we're working on. It's still very early days in doing this. There's lots of, to be honest, problems that don't scale very well in doing this. It's kind of easy when you're dealing with a chain like John Lewis, or you're dealing with, or no, it's not easy when you're dealing with National Rail and you want to get the plans for their railway stations and everything else. That's kind of hard to do. But imagine doing that for every building. That's really hard. Imagine going out and surveying the Wi-Fi signal in every building. And we have history of messing that up. So we have to be really careful about doing that. But it's still really, really useful. People find this stuff really useful. So this is a space to watch. There are various technologies that are competing to do indoor mapping. And so it's definitely a place to watch. So that advert was from Garmin. Garmin are a well-known manufacturer of GPS equipment, sat-navs. But the basic message of that was, paper maps are dead. And I agree. The map of the future is not a map. It's not paper. Paper actually is awful as a medium for communicating geospatial technology. We've been stuck with it, clearly, for the last 1,000 years, but actually is rubbish for doing geospatial information because you're fixed in terms of once you've printed it, that's it, the information is stuck on that page. You can't do things that are below the paper, you can't do things that are above the paper. Paper can't animate, you can't change the direction of north on the paper. It's awful, but that's been our mindset. We think geospatial technology, we think maps, we think paper. We're kind of stuck in that mindset. I want to free us from that and say the future is not driven by cartography that was controlled by paper as being the medium. And we're no longer stuck with that. Here's an example of the map of my home in southwest London, in Teddington. Now this map, even though it's a kind of standard web map and we're very familiar with it, is unique to me. I'm the only person that sees this map. And likewise, certainly if you've logged in using your Google account, you will not see this map. You will see a map that's specific to you. As of about, probably 6 months ago now, if you have a Google account, you will get personalized maps being created for you. And it means that basically no two maps will ever be the same again. They'll all be slightly different depending upon our interests, our needs, our history in terms of what we've done in the past using these maps. There are a few features that make this map unique to me. One is, you can't quite see it very well, but just about there's a little orange icon that represents my home. I haven't told necessarily the system where my home is, but it's kind of worked out from the past where I've looked at creating maps for, when I've asked for directions, it's kind of worked out that's where my home is. You can see a few businesses have a kind of yellow halo around them. Those are businesses that I reviewed or friends of mine have reviewed, and those are places that we have a bit more information about. Other people won't see that. Now, if you've not been involved in this technology very long, you think, well, Ed, big deal, you know, no two maps are the same. That's not that impressive. But actually, the technology behind the scenes to do this is very impressive. When I started at Google 5 years ago, to generate all the map tiles that we did for the whole world took about 6 weeks of computer processing using a classified number of computers, but lots. So it took 6 weeks to do that. We're now generating these map tiles on the fly for 1 billion people. So technology has changed enormously to allow us to create these maps dynamically. One of the things that has made this possible in some ways is HTML5. And you'll, I guess if you work in the web, you know all about HTML5. It allows you to create truly dynamic web maps because you're not necessarily just sending pictures anymore, you're sending data, and that data can be visualized within a browser to make the information dynamic. And here's a really good example of that. This is St. Paul's Cathedral, and as you watch me move the mouse around, you see the parallax, you'll see the top of St. Paul's move depending upon where I am. You see it kind of shifting from one side to the other? That's because I'm actually rendering that data in the client, and the client is working out the geometry to show me as that building moves around. Now, it's a little thing, and many people won't notice that that's happening. But for the geeks amongst us, we should be going, wow, that's really cool that you're able to do that. And the thing, you know, that map is truly dynamic. Try and do that with your paper map. It's just not going to happen. I've really got a thing for paper maps. It's really annoying me. But it's worse. Paper maps are really in trouble. Because I think the future of maps isn't maps at all. And let me give you an example of that. A day in my life starts off with some breakfast cereal. There's no geospatial technology involved in the breakfast cereal, so we'll move on. I leave my home, and this is my mobile phone, pictures of my children on it. And what I'm doing now is I'm making use of a new feature in the Android operating system called Google Now. And what Google Now is contextual information that is largely driven by my location and by my personality. about the information I have stored on my phone. Our phones are incredibly powerful sources of information. They contain a lot of information about us, a huge amount of information. And you really need to be careful about it. Who's got their mobile phone with them now? Okay, get your mobile phones out. Love a bit of audience participation. Okay. All got smartphones, I assume. Right, everybody unlock your smartphone because you have put a lock on it, haven't you? Yeah. Okay, unlock your smartphone and give it to the person sitting next to you. Do you want to do that? No, you probably don't. Don't worry, you don't have to do that. It was just an example. You don't really have to do that. It gives you a sense of how much that device is personal to you. It contains, your pictures, your contacts, your live Twitter account, all sorts of content. But that content is really, really powerful because it can contextualize your information. So back to Google now. I swipe my finger from the bottom to the middle of the screen, and up pops some contextual information for me. Now, this is a real example. Happened about 2 weeks ago. On that day, I was flying from London City Airport to Nice. I was going to a meeting. And immediately it's gone off, and it's found that the flight is on time. And it's given me now directions how to get to London City based upon the real-time traffic conditions at my location at that point in time of day. Now, I've not asked it for anything. All I've done is swipe my finger up, and it's gone and it's looked into my calendar, found out I'm booked on that flight. It's gone and found if the flight's running on time. It's gone off, and it's continually working out, okay, how do you get from where you are, again, I haven't told it where I am, to London City. Now, it so happens that by default, it will give me driving directions. And you'd be an idiot, basically, to drive from where I live to London City. This was quite early in the morning, so the traffic's not too bad. It's given me 3 different routes to take. Again, this is real time, looking at the travel restrictions at that point in time. But actually, what I want to do is go by public transport. So I say, tell me, how would I do it by public transport? And again, without me asking the specific questions, it's gone off and worked out, okay, by public transport, you'd need to walk from where you are to the station. Then this train departs at 11 minutes past 7, it's 10 stops, it's going to take 40 minutes, get to Waterloo, get off, get on the Jubilee line, blah, blah, blah. All of this information is being generated behind the scenes and made relevant to me based upon a knowledge of what I'm doing at any particular point in time and based on my past history. So I get to London City, get on the airplane, fly down to Nice. It's much nicer in Nice. Again, I pull my finger up, and now it gives me the weather for where I am in Nice, 26 degrees. Because I'm in France, it knows that you might want to have translation help, and it gives me the exchange rate. All of that, again, without me asking specifically for those pieces of information. It's making use of my context. It's making use of the fact that it now knows that I'm in France to present me with that different information. Now, a lot of this, as I said, is being powered by geospatial technology. And perhaps in the past, I might have put loads of maps up. But actually, those maps are getting in the way of this information that is relevant to me at those particular points in time. So, the future of the map is no map. Geospatial technology can order and present information to me that's relevant without necessarily having to use a map to communicate it. You've probably seen that video a couple of times on the web. That's Project Glass, which is the augmented reality glasses that Google is working at. They'll be available at some point next year, probably. But the reason I show that is if you think about it, a lot of what I was talking about in terms of Google Go and the Annotated World is powering that project. A lot of it is being powered by geospatial technology, the locations of restaurants, the fact that he wants to meet somebody, all of those things. It's the same underlying infrastructure, it's the same underlying data. We're now, rather than using the paper map, we're using augmented reality glasses as a way of interfacing with that same content. Now, they may well work really well, and in 10 years we may all be wearing augmented reality glasses. Maybe we won't, maybe we'll still be using mobile devices. Maybe there'll be a combination of those. But the thing will be the same is all of that information, and that information being presented to us in a very personalized way will happen without a question. Now, I'm sure this will come up in the question and answer session afterwards. There are, of course, privacy implications involved with doing this. You know, when we get really useful information being presented to us, it gets really close to being creepy. And it's kind of managing that boundary between being very useful, very personalized, and creepy that we need to continually be aware of. Okay, that's the end of the advert. Next big topic, big data. You'll hear loads about big data, largely because at this point in time it's mostly a marketing term rather than anything else. But there is something going on here. And in geospatial terms, if you talk to most people in the industry, they go, oh, big data, I laugh at big data. We've done big data forever. We know big data. It's not a big deal. Well, maybe. Trouble is, our concept of big data is this. Not a water tank. What I'm saying here is our concept of big data is about volume. We think in terms of big databases of petabytes of information. You know, behind Google Earth, there's probably approaching 6 petabytes worth of data. And yeah, we can deal with these big data sets. You know, disks are cheap, memory's cheap, not a problem. Show us your biggest data set, we can deal with that, say the spatial guys. But that's not really what big data is about. The trouble with these big databases, large volume databases that we often deal with in the geospatial world is that they are mostly static. You fill up your tank and it kind of remains the same. It doesn't change very much. What we need to recognize is that big data is actually not about volume, but about velocity. It's about smaller amounts of information, but information that's very, very rapidly changing. And we still struggle with this. This is something we need to work on as an industry. And I'll give you the perfect case study for this. We did some research with part of the European Commission, and what we wanted to do was to say, if we looked at just Twitter messages, could we analyze Twitter messages that mentioned environmental disasters like forest fires or earthquakes, and use the Twitter messages to somehow delimitate where the event was happening? And I said, oh yeah, that sounds feasible, we'll do that. We'll pour all these Twitter messages into an Oracle database and we'll analyze them. The trouble is, you know, the fire hose, as it's called, coming out of Twitter, is huge volumes of data, lots of data going past very, very quickly. You can fill up an Oracle database. You can't query the database quick enough for the new information coming in. Probably not a great surprise to most of you in the audience if you come from a web background, but SQL databases are no good to you if you want to deal with big data. You end up dealing with these terms. If you don't recognize these sorts of databases and this sorts of technology, go buy a book, because you really do need to learn about these. This is what you need to deal with to handle big data. And big data, we think, is bad now. It's going to get much worse. Today, it's estimated there are 35 billion devices connected to the internet. And that comes from Vint Cerf, who works for Google and was one of the founders of the internet, so he should know. It works out, certainly in the UK, about 6 devices each of us own that are connected to the internet. And I think probably in this audience, that's a massive underestimate. If you think about the number of devices that you own that are connected to the internet, have an IP address, it's going to be much more than 6. I think I can't actually count the number of devices I have at home that are connected to the internet. I've just completely lost track. It's probably over 40 devices I have at home that are connected to the internet. No idea what they all are, what they're doing. What is interesting about many of these devices, and in the future many of the devices that will be connected to the internet, is that they are sensors. This is my phone. This is the Galaxy Nexus, kind of last year's phone in many ways, but it contains a proximity sensor. That's how it knows when you hold it up to your ear to switch the screen off. It's got an accelerometer, so it knows when you're moving the phone around. Obviously, it's got a light, it's got a camera, there's a gyroscope, it has a GPS receiver, digital compass, a microphone. The new Samsung Galaxy S3 also has a barometer in it, which makes this little piece of electronics more powerful than this. This is PINGS. This is the inertial navigation system that got the Apollo astronauts to the moon and back. I have a similar capability in terms of inertial navigation now on my phone. And that allows me to do interesting things. We've been experimenting, remember I was talking about the great indoors, been experimenting using mobile devices like this to navigate inside tube stations, where there's no GPS signal at all. You get a GPS signal, as soon as you go into the tube station, you've lost the GPS signal. But it's got an accelerometer, so it knows it's moving. It's got a digital compass, so it knows which way is north. It's got a barometer now, so it knows as you go down, you're going down, or go up, you're going up. It's accurate enough for about 20 minutes or so to navigate you through a tube station. That's incredible, if you think about it, just through one of these devices. But you have to think about this not as a device for looking at the web, but as a device that's a sensor itself. Loads of new applications will come thinking of it in that way. Next trend, crowdsourcing 2.0. It was fun to add 2.0 on the end of a term. A lot of the crowdsourcing that we've seen in the geospatial world up until now has been about trying to replicate something that you could already do using an existing process. So it's a fantastic project called OpenStreetMap, which is about creating a map of the world as an alternative way of the big vendors and mapping agencies doing it. And that itself is brilliant. I'm not going to argue that that's not a good thing to do. But what crowdsourcing 2.0, I think, is about is capturing information that you couldn't capture before without using a crowd. And it uses the very democratic nature of a crowd to capture information that previously you couldn't get. And this is a perfect example. This is a project that's been going not particularly long. I think it's from Boston University. And it's basically saying to the residents of Boston, produce a map of the city with your view of the different neighborhoods. So there are the different neighborhoods in Boston, and you're presented with this nice, very simple map interface, and you say, okay, Brighton, where do you think that is? And you digitize it on the screen. And then it then starts to collect all the different boundaries that people have digitized. And you can see where there's agreement, you get kind of a thick red line. Where there's less agreement, you get a thin red line. And you can then start to look at the individual neighborhoods and see what you get. And some interesting patterns emerge. So here's Beacon Hill. So this is kind of a historic part of Boston. You see there's a lot of agreement. Most people can pretty much identify the streets that make the boundary of Beacon Hill. Bay Village, a lot less agreement. Likewise as well, what was that? Alston, very little agreement. Big disagreement there. Chinatown as well, and you would have thought Chinatown, that was something you could recognize, this is Chinatown. No, there's quite a lot of disagreement around that. And this is what I mean by crowdsourcing, collecting information you wouldn't otherwise get access to. This is getting a true community to contribute information that gives you a different view of the city and how, from a social perspective, how coordinated or consolidated the city is. That's an example of explicit crowdsourcing. We're actually asking people to contribute information. The other important type of crowdsourcing is one that's implicit, where just by your very actions, you're collecting information. This is the sort of information that you can collect in that implicit way. This is a map of Dublin showing you the average speed of traffic throughout the whole of the city, or at least the main routes in the city. Now, normally, the way you would capture this data is to put sensors into the road, and that's an expensive, capital expensive process, and you end up only really putting the sensors into the major roads. This data is coming from people's mobile phones. As they're moving around their day-to-day lives, We're monitoring the locations of the phones, completely anonymously, I must add. So we don't know whose mobile phones they are, but we can use those to measure in real time the speed of traffic. And there's an element of heuristics here. We've got to make sure that we're actually measuring someone that's actually in a car as opposed to someone's walking. Now, in London at the moment, it's quite hard to tell the difference between someone walking and someone being in a car. But you can generate a kind of a heuristic to get around that. But that's, that you couldn't get from any other source of data. You're collecting a crowd's worth of information, consolidating all that together, and producing some useful content. Okay, I don't know, this is kind of geeky, but it's something that we talk about a lot in the UK, linked data. Who's heard of linked data? Yeah, okay. So linked data is this campaign, I suppose, largely coming from computer scientists, Tim Berners-Lee, Nigel Shadbolt, and so on, to make the web more intelligent, i.e. to add more semantic or more knowledge to web pages so they ultimately become more useful. Web pages, as you know, as you work in the web, the HTML that you use to create a web page is largely about how do I want it to appear on the screen, not the actual content of the web page itself. And there's a lot of hard work that's gone on into developing ontologies and ways of categorizing content to make it more intelligent. It's hard. I think there is a way out. There's an organization called schema.org that we are supporting along with Microsoft and Yahoo and some others. They're kind of a lightweight version of the semantic web. And it's basically using microdata to tag the content of a web page to say this is an address, this is a photograph, this is an event, and add a little bit more intelligence to a web page. How might that work? Well, here's some HTML, very much abstracted. So you can say, this is about the Champions League semi-final, second leg, on this particular date. And those of you who can read a little bit of HTML can see, oh, well, there were 2 links there. That's about it. As humans, relatively intelligent humans, we can identify the fact that, well, there's a date there. This is a location, New Camp, Barcelona. There's an event. We're talking about a semi-final. To a computer, to a browser looking at that page, it's just text. It's just instructions to draw the text on the screen. When we add the microdata, when we add a schema to that, we add additional tags to say that Spain here is actually a country, Barcelona is a locality, New Camp is a location, there's a date, and so on. And the Champions League semi-final is an event. And we're just adding a few extra tags, and it suddenly makes that content more useful to those kind of applications like Google Now that's saying, okay, I see this New Camp thing in your calendar. If I know that that's a location, I can start to process that more effectively. Okay, I'm going to finish. Some final thoughts. So, the things to take away from today. Paper maps are dead. Hooray! Okay. A lot of what I've been talking about, if you think about it, you boil it down, is about more personalized information. It's about making our experience on the web that bit more personal. Location is a component of that, for sure. It provides us with context. It says, we are sitting in Farnham Castle at this particular point in time. So the sorts of information that's going to be useful and relevant to me are constrained a little bit by their location. But also they could be constrained by the fact that it's a hot summer's evening and we might want to go out for a drink rather than immediately going for a curry. So that's contextual information. So a lot of our experience is going to be based on those more personal pieces of information. And a lot of it is going to come through us sharing perhaps more information. But if we're going to do that, I have to be really honest, if you're going to do that, you are going to have to share information only with organizations that we trust and only organizations that we know what's going to happen to that data with. So the whole industry, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Yahoo, if we're going to build a more useful web, a web that's going to be more personalized, more contextual, we're going to have to get your trust. We're going to have to make sure that the information that we collect from you, that you share with us, is held securely, it is used in a way that you're happy with, that you're familiar with. And that's the challenge. We need to do that to make this world happen. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to use the microphone. Graham, you want to be my runner? That might help. Let's see if this works. I'll turn the level up. Okay, should work. Any questions? There,
I think we can start at the front here.
Thanks very much. Ed, great talk. Thanks. Loads of food for thought in that. I'm from WWF, the conservation charity. We just down the road in Godalming. And we're in the process of trying to undertake a very, well, as far as I'm aware, the largest global project involving geospatial technology and other stuff. So loads of stuff chime, but one particular question I have for you was that 3D technology you showed, which is obviously awesome looking at London. How would that work on something like the Serengeti or the Amazon, where you've obviously got, it's not featureless, but from high above, it's hard to replicate. And I'm just curious how that would apply to those type of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it would work in pretty much the same way, in that you're capturing information, and you probably do it from satellite imagery in those areas rather than photography. But as long as you can basically capture an area from 4 different angles, and you know the exact location from which those photographs were taken, as you would do from the satellite images, you can build up the model. So it would contain the whole relief, it would contain the fact that the trees were higher than the plains. It would look, more realistic than Google Earth currently looks in those areas. It wouldn't work as well because you haven't got the physical structures that make the big difference, but it would be a much better experience than you currently see. That said, to be honest, and I'll be brutally honest, our focus is on getting the urban areas done first. But that same technology, no doubt, will come and it will cover the whole globe. Because remember, when we started out in 2005, Google Maps covered the United States and the UK only, nowhere else. Everywhere else was blank. And since then, we've filled in the whole world. Now, in effect, we're starting again. And we'll start at the beginning with a relatively small area, and then we'll do the whole world again.
We just need the Wi-Fi in the Serengeti. So.
Minor problem.
We've got a cluster in the back here. Shall we start with the gentleman in the check shirt?
Hi, Ed. Thanks. Fascinating speech. John here. I was just wondering if everybody's phone in the future has a barometer, does that mean that we all become mobile weather stations of sorts, and ergo weather prediction becomes a lot more accurate because it's pretty rubbish at the moment?
A very good question. It's probably still open to debate whether every phone will have a barometer on it. It's one phone at the moment, and chances are they will do. If you can put it onto the chipset cheaply enough, then they will be on every phone. And then you're absolutely right. We have been talking to the Met Office, and they're really interested in getting weather measurements more widely distributed than they are at the moment. I mean, at the moment, our weather forecasts are based on a few hundred fixed weather stations that have been there forever. And if you can have potentially, 100 million weather records appearing from all around Europe, then potentially your climate models can improve, your weather forecasting can improve. So yeah, that's definitely a potential.
We are the sensor network.
Thanks, Ed. I really enjoyed the talk, but obviously you're showing us a lot of what Google's doing in this space, which I'd expect given who pays your mortgage. But
they do, yeah, definitely.
You mentioned linked data. Obviously, open data is another part of the mix, and the government particularly making lots of data sets available for people to mash up. How much of what you've talked about tonight remains proprietary to Google, and how much is open to integrate with everything else?
There are elements of it that are proprietary. As I said, a lot of the success in geospatial data comes from having rich content that you get access to. But that said, much of the content that we use today is coming from open government sources and open data sources. And we're big proponents of governments releasing those data sets. I'm good. Is the video camera still on? No, you see, he's not, okay. Well, we had a quite productive conversation with Transport for London over a relatively short period of time to get access to bus timetables. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so our modus operandi around this is that any data that you contribute to Google, you should be able to get back out again yourself. And that we do through this idea called the data liberation front. So the map maker content that I was showing, the idea is that you put content in and then you'll be able to get it back out again and then contribute to whatever other sources of information you want to do so. And then above that, all of the content that we create is then made available via APIs, which we find is the way that gets the biggest impact in terms of most people get access to it in that way. There are a few people that want access to the raw data, but most people want us to do the kind of dirty work to make it clean and then make it available via an API. And that's the way that most people get access to the content.
I think we'll go to the other side of the house, just
Okay.
for a change of scenery. We don't want to be too rightist or...
Hi, I just have a sort of slightly more prosaic issue. If you are storing all of this data and collecting all of this data and taking stuff off our phones without us knowing...
Oh, no, you'll always know that we're taking
but we
it
don't
off your
know...
phone.
There's a tracking thing there and everything. There's a huge energy requirement for all of that.
Yeah.
How is Google addressing that?
Do you mean energy on the device or energy in general in terms of server farms and...
All of it. There's,
all of it.
You know, the taking it.
Yeah.
There's the battery stuff at the phone end. There's the massive data farms. There's the energy required just to process it all.
Yeah. Okay. Big question. So let's take it from the server farm end first. So at the very beginnings of us building data centers, we always took the approach to design our own using our own low energy servers. So rather than going to one of the big manufacturers and buying big rack mounted servers, we build our own computers. We build our own servers based on our own circuit board design that only have the components that we need in a server. So it's largely memory and a processor and a network card. And we put those in very energy efficient storage racks in containers, and they are widely regarded as kind of the most energy efficient servers that there are in the industry. And then we try to place those in places where we can minimize the requirement for artificial cooling, because all these computers, they generate a lot of heat. So we try to put our server farms in places where we can make use of water cooling and so on. So we try really hard to minimize the energy consumption of our server farms, but server farms will always need a lot of energy. We're doing our best to minimize that as much as we possibly can. And there's a lot the industry can still do, and it comes from looking at it in a slightly different way. So building servers that only have the components you absolutely have to need. It didn't take us long to work out you don't need a graphics card in a server because you're never going to plug it into a head, you're never going to view anything, so let's just ignore that. So that sort of thinking, I think, is useful. On the other end, on the client side, if you like, on your mobile phone, the big draws on your mobile phone still are two things, largely the screen and the radios, and the many radios that we now have on our devices. You can be very intelligent from a software point of view in terms of how you manage those components. So you can make sure that you, interactively make use of the screen, dim it whenever you have the capability to dim it. And in terms of the radios, we can do a lot in terms of switching the radios on and off intelligently, so that, for example, if I know that you've not been moving for the last 5 minutes, I can power down the GPS knowing that you're not moving. And then I can power the GPS up again when I sense that you're moving from the accelerometer. And the accelerometer draws much less power than the GPS does. And I can do clever things like that to increase the battery life. But you're right, it's still, at both ends, it's still a really big challenge. Don't worry, I see it.
A lot of the data that you're using, the big data that you're using, has got a finite timescale that it's valid for, the stuff you're using with the pictures from the street view. Do you foresee a problem with you having to expire this data at a later date because it's become too old?
Yeah, I mean, that is a big challenge, for sure. Actually, knowing when data becomes stale. For a lot of the case, the street view image that we've got of the market here, that was taken probably about 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. And the vast majority of it is still valid. Still, there's been a few businesses that have changed. It's how do we decide when we're going to go and do it again? And how do we decide to drive again? So we've driven, for example, a few parts of London again with the Olympics coming up, and we knew we had to kind of refresh the data. But that knowing when, the intelligence of when to do that, that's a big challenge. There's another challenge that might not be as obvious in that what you see in Street View now is a processed version of the imagery that we actually capture. We have to blur people's faces, blur registration plates, do all of that stuff. The raw data that we originally used to capture that information, we've had to destroy because of data protection issues. Now, I'd argue that raw data is in itself quite valuable. In 100 years' time, that would have been really nice to have access to that imagery, but we don't have that anymore. We've had to destroy it. So we, I think, have to get a sense of the value of that information from those different perspectives. One, yes, it is personal information and we need to treat it carefully, but at the same time, it's historically quite valuable information. And I think as an industry, we need to understand much more the value of the data that we're capturing and its historic significance. There's one down the front, Graham.
There's one here. Since we've got time for two
How much
questions
time
and
have you
then wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you. It follows on from what you were just saying, actually. You capture an amazing amount of information. Digital storage is amazingly finite. It doesn't last very long. You talk about maps and paper, right? Paper has lasted 1,000 years.
Yeah.
What happens in 200 years? This data won't exist. Where's our history? How do we archive this stuff properly?
Again, a very good question, and something that lots of people are working on. I mean, the current best sort of thinking in terms of archiving is you just keep moving the bits from one thing to another thing. So, you move from tapes to disk drives, and from disk drives to solid state memory, and from solid state memory to somewhere else, and you never keep it still. You just keep things moving around. And that, from a kind of a storage point of view, is kind of the safe way of working. But you're right, again, it's one of those really big challenges for the industry to look back or look at really carefully and say, are we really being secure with this data? And I think as I said, there's the policy issue as well of saying, well, we wouldn't be destroying paper records in the same way that we're destroying digital records for these policy reasons. We didn't go and burn the census of 20 years ago because it was personal information. There's a danger that we'll destroy all of this personal information because it's digital, just because it's digital. And I think we need to get a head around that as well.
You just said about expiring data. If you're expiring data, it's gone. Whereas paper maps will always be stored.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the issue. We can keep the data. We can, there are technical ways of keeping the data. It's just ones and zeros, ultimately, how you store them. What I'm more concerned around these kind of policy issues is saying we somehow treat digital data different to the paper equivalent. And there'd be an outcry if we went around burning paper records and destroying paper records in the same way. But yeah, the policymakers see that as different. And yeah, there are some arguments in terms of, yes, you can conflate it differently. But I do think there's a huge amount of value that we are losing by companies destroying these records.
One last question, I believe.
Hi. How do you think the communications capability is going to enable, or rather actually frustrate you? Because you're creating more data all the time, you're asking more data to be passed, so you're using up bandwidth. And mobile bandwidth is probably not growing as fast as you're actually using it.
Yeah.
Then secondly, it's not a problem in the US so much, but for us guys, when we leave the country, we can't afford the data plan, so all your wonderful phones become dumb again. So how's that actually frustrating your plans?
Yeah, hugely. It is a real frustration. I mean, it is getting better in Europe. You know, in the last year, we've seen through the European Commission, you know, caps imposed on the data roaming charges, which mean that, you know, it's probably just about affordable now to check your email and do a little bit of web surfing while you're roaming, but you certainly still wouldn't be streaming videos, you know, when you're sitting on the beach in Spain. Still way too expensive. You're right, I mean, that is frustrating, and, you know, that is something that we kind of look at, but we don't have any solution to that part of the industry. You know, I think the telcos have issues that they need to deal with in terms of, you know, their business models and, you know, the focus they've had on the past in voice and text, and that's where they're going to get all their value from. And the reality is now very few of us actually use our phones to talk to people. We're using them as, you know, mobile computers. So there's a difference in value there that the telco industries kind of need to access. And hey, I'm not going to give them any solution to that. I can't, I'm afraid.
It's going to affect your business model, and it's going to affect any startup's business model who is dependent upon those things, because that's a constraint.
It is, but then, you know, I think there are some technology changes, you know, in the medium term that will change the landscape a lot, and that we won't, you know, the mobile web of the future won't be tied necessarily to the mobile phone companies of today. So, you know, I think things will change, but, you know, over the next 5 years, we're kind of stuck with what we've got.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for a fantastic talk. Thank you.